rapidly increasing. So welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. I don't think it's evening yet for anyone unless you're joining from New Zealand. I think New Zealand's 2 hours ahead of us. It's probably as far ahead of us as you can get, but we're almost at the beginning of time here in Australia. We're ahead of most people. Stress from staff regarding mandatory vaccinations. Yeah, that's a tough one. 6:30 a.m. in Dublin, Ireland. Thanks, Sinead. I lived in Dublin, Ireland for 2 years. And you're coming into winter. It was one of the reasons I left Dublin, Ireland, was the winters in Ireland. Will this be available after the session in case people have missed it? Bridget, it will be. There will be a recording. You'll get sent a link to that recording. Motivation and focus. Yeah, Ed, thank you. Hi, Michael. Hi, Rafiq. Welcome, everyone. How to stabilize mood, especially in this COVID-restricted world. Good morning from Belgium. Thank you. Fear of employees outsourcing after working in the company for a few years. The growth of great resignation, right? Yeah. Hi from NZ. So Jeremy, hi. You're probably one of the few people on this webinar that's ahead of us in time. Good morning from Dubai. Hi, Simonetta. Good morning. Just love these webinars. You're such an international audience. Okay, so I'm now going to get going. We're 3 minutes past the hour. And I know some of you know me and some of you don't. So I'm going to assume you don't know me, and I'll do some introductions in a minute. So this webinar is about employee mental well-being. And so we've already said to you, you can put some pieces in the chat function. You've already did hello from Mauritius. Thank you. Mental well-being is a passion of mine. And before we get going into the actual content of the webinar, I want to share something with you. Did you know that 69%, get my slides right here, 69% of organizations have ineffective or non-existent mental well-being strategies, which is fascinating because we keep hearing about the mental health epidemic, but we are at around the 70% mark of organizations actually have a completely non-working or ineffective mental well-being strategy. That's a big poll we ran on LinkedIn. And then additionally, just yesterday, I saw a CNBC poll on LinkedIn that tells us only 9% of people agree that companies are doing enough to support the mental health of their employees. So Julian and I were both shocked because we had assumptions that all these organizations were doing mental well-being, mental well-being, everybody must be doing it because it's talked about so much in the media. But if you look at the polls, actually not so much. And additionally, a lot of organizations have got mental well-being strategies that are simply not delivering, they're not working. And we're going to explain a couple of the whys about that in a minute. So aside from the non-existent strategies, here are some of the main challenges we're seeing in this space that likely apply to you as well if you've dialed into this webinar. So how many of you have a well-being strategy that's good on paper, but it's not really making any kind of difference? How many of you realize that mental well-being is a workplace culture challenge? So it's not just helping the individual, it's also the way we work together, which one of our participants has already highlighted. But you aren't sure what to do about that or help your leaders work with the culture to actually support mental well-being. It's not just about sending people off to EAP programs. How do you actually change the culture? And then for how many of you in HR, OD, or L&D or well-being positions have proposed actually meaningful solutions that will make a difference, but you get pushback from management, too much time, too much effort, etc. It's like, give us the window dressing, please. Give us the care package. We can just send everybody some scented soap and candles and they'll feel better, but it won't actually make much difference to anything. So today we're going to help you understand some of these challenges and address them more effectively. Okay, so a little bit about me first. So before we get into the content, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Bunting. I've been absolutely obsessed with understanding human behavior my entire life. And I'm passionate about the connection between leadership, culture, performance, and mental health. So one of the interesting pieces of research we've done with the Mindful Leader, which is the middle book, is that 33% of a person's mental health can be explained by their boss's behavior. So the idea of separating out mental health strategies from the organization and sending people off to just get mentally well is a little bit crazy. And we've discovered that in our work. But this webinar is more focused on how do you help people in general, not just leaders. So we have that other part of our business as well. And then most importantly, we have a digital solution, which we've been working on now for several years, my co-founder, Julian Ramond, is on the call, and Julian and I have been jointly obsessed with the question of how can you help people at scale, not just expensive one-on-one courses, to develop genuine skills that last a lifetime and make a meaningful difference to self-awareness, to effectiveness, to mental well-being, to engagement, and so forth. And Julian's on the call today, and he'll be responding or trying to respond to some of the comments. Thank you very much for the plug on the Mindful Leader book. Yeah, and we've got another book coming out next year, which is a deeper dive on the Mindful Leader. So Julian's here with us today, and he'll also be looking at the comments. Obviously, it's hard for me while I'm chatting or presenting to look at the comments. And Julian's just said hi on the chat function. Okay, so a bit about our business. We work with a lot of big global multinationals, but we also work with middle and smaller organizations. Now, those are some of the brands you will know. And again, we work in we're odd in the sense that we do mental well-being, but we also do genuine scaled culture change, values work. And it's interesting because there's a mixed point between these that they all meet together. A healthy culture should actually support mental well-being, but there's also the need for supporting individuals with the skills of helping themselves to be mentally well. And this leads me to this really important point, that mental well-being is primarily about helping people with inner skills. And this research project, research study done by Sean Achor, the fellow at the picture, was a 12-year research study on happiness, and one of the biggest of its kind that's ever been run. And at the end of this extensive study, one of the quotes from Sean Achor is, "In reality, if I knew everything about your external world, I can only predict 10% of your long-term happiness. 90% of long-term happiness, i.e. mental well-being, is predicted by how your brain processes the world. The brain processes the world part is actually about how you manage your attention. So the only thing we truly, truly have full choice of is where and how to direct our attention. And when we're directing our attention on the wrong things, it's eroding our well-being." And even in the chat function, you'll see a lot of us are, and it's natural because we haven't been given the skills. We're very obsessed with the external world to us and how can we change or manage this external world. And that's also one of the traps I'll discuss in a moment. And this bringing the attention to the external world, if you look at this data, basically we're trying to change the 10% and we're giving all our energy to changing the 10% instead of trying to change the 90%, which is how we are meeting and processing the world. It's obviously extremely helpful if you do that 90% in groups, which is kind of paradoxical, because the more you do it together with others, the more you can support each other with what we call a mindfulness right view, the redirecting of the attention in a healthy way. So for example, instead of asking the question, how can I make the world more stable? We ask the question, how can I help myself be more comfortable with the inherent instability in the world? What skills do I need to do? What mindsets do I need to develop to become better and more relaxed about the inherent instability? Because one of the facts about, particularly in mindfulness practice, is that reality is inherently unstable, will always be unstable. There is no security and there is no stability. So with that truth, how do I train this mind to be more happier and well and effective within that truth? So some of the key things we're going to cover today, 3 key things. Number 1, I just want to cover the idea that mental well-being is a process, not an event. So I will explain why events and great workshops don't solve the problem and what to do about it. So bad news, even this webinar, if you find this useful and interesting, that's a start, but this webinar cannot in and of itself affect your mental well-being or affect your organization's mental well-being. No webinar can. It takes a process over time. So if you're throwing events, lots of events around mental well-being and bringing in great guest speakers, you're going to be disappointed because ultimately you're not going to get the results you're looking for. Secondly, resources are often misguided. And it's not only about horizontal development. I'm going to explain that a bit later, but let me just explain. I'm going to help you understand that we misunderstand how people grow and change. And this misunderstanding of how people grow and change, and particularly how mental well-being works, results ironically in our solutions often adding to the problem. So we add more and more and more clutter. It's like the person who's struggling with overwork, and then you send them on a course on how to deal with overwork, which actually increases their workload. And it's like, you know, often we get caught in these spirals as well. We give more and more to people in an already overcluttered world is unhelpful. Okay, and we'll talk a bit more about that. And the third thing is all mental well-being is underpinned by self-regulation. So I'll explain to you that the missing ingredient from most mental well-being programs, actually, for that matter, most leadership development programs as well, is this idea of, or this principle of self-regulation, this ability to know what I'm doing and then to make constructive choices in the moment. And how, if I don't have that, more or less, I'm lost. I have nothing. So, thank you. Okay, I'm just checking the chat function there. Before we get into the 3 points in more detail, especially for those of you who are actually in charge of or thinking about your mental well-being strategy of your organization, we want to thank you for being here again. And we've given you, in this next slide, a little checklist that you might want to download. Come on, slide, move. A little checklist to use QR scan code this on your phone. If you're on your computer, just scan that. And it's a little checklist for you to help understand your own mental well-being strategy and where perhaps they're missing pieces and what you might want to do about it. I'll just leave it there for a second. And Julian, my co-founder of Awaken Mind, will, there it is. He's popped a link. If you're on your phone, there's a link for it in the chat function. You will get a copy of this webinar, but I'm not sure. Julian, I'm assuming people also get that in the emails if we send them the recording.
The PDF download is going to be sent automatically as soon as you complete the form on that link.
Okay, so as soon as you can get that. All right, so let's go back to point one. Mental well-being is a process, not an event. And this actually, I'm going to illustrate this from a story. So one of our clients asked us to run a webinar series, which is usually where we start with clients. Webinars are usually our way for building awareness, like, you know, what's this all about? And often it's for HR or OD people to help expose us to senior management to get a taste of it, then hopefully they want more. And we ran a webinar series for the top 10% leaders in the organization. And the webinar series was extremely popular. And in fact, the feedback we were given was it's the best webinar series that they've ever run in the organization. And then the question was, okay, so can we roll this webinar series out to all of our, and there were many thousands of people they wanted to roll it out to. And I asked the simple question, what are you trying to achieve? And the answer I got back is we want genuine behavior change in the workplace, because the webinars were talking about the value of values and how to align yourself with values and how that helps mental well-being as well as performance, organizational trust, and so forth. And so I just simply asked, do you believe that exposing people to webinars will create the disciplined behavior change you're really wanting? Are you aware of what it takes to change behavior? Have you got any science behind that? And of course, the answer was no. And as a result of that conversation, we built a very different program for them. And that program is built off what I'm about to share with you. So it's based off BJ Fogg, who's the world's leading light on behavior science, behavior change science. And it has to get proper embedded behavior change. Now, let's just be clear. Mental well-being is basically changing behavior. So it's changing either mental processes or attitudinal processes, but primarily that will result in some kind of change behavior. So it might result in me going from watching Netflix to meditating, or eating too much to going for walks. There's some kind of behavior change. There's some kind of proactive, constructive behavior change that must happen to support a healthier way of being, including mental well-being. For that to happen, three things need to be in place. The first is motivation. So people need to be motivated. What's usually required, and this is probably for those of you who already have good webinars and excellent information on mental well-being, you're probably doing pretty well in this. You're giving people a lot of information and insight. So that, you know, it could be something like, did you know if you walk 3 times a week, you know, X happens to your mental well-being, etc. And what we're trying to do is establish motivation. Unfortunately, if you just give motivation, you don't get change. The second thing you need is ability. And this is where it gets tricky, interestingly enough. For behavior change to happen over time, it needs to be really, really simple. So interesting research that's come out of Harvard on the adult development side is that it takes about 12 to 18 months to change one behavior. The trap that we often get into, whether it be mental well-being or leadership or culture, is we get caught in, I need to do these 5 things. I need to do them. And then what happens is we kind of maybe survive for like 2 or 3 days and then all crashes. It's all too much. So we kind of exacerbate our overwhelm, and we don't trust the simplicity of one simple behavior change. Now, it's important that that simple behavior change has insight and information behind it that's critical. So now we're building. And the third thing we need for behavior change to happen is a process over time. So again, why events don't work. You need a process over time. The very minimum process we tend to do is 8 weeks. So there's an 8-week process that involves prompts. So it's a little bit like, BJ Fogg talks about it, where he had a prompt where he wanted to do press-ups. So every time he went to the bathroom to take a pee, he did 5 press-ups. The bathroom was that's the prompt to do my press-ups. What we find very useful in our work is that if you have meetings, you collectively meet again every now and again on what you're practicing, on what you're doing. There are prompts and reminders, and they also create a kind of healthy accountability. It's like if you had a fitness coach and they met you every 2 weeks and you had to update them on what you were doing around your fitness. Just that simple meeting with a coach will create some kind of motivation and accountability. And so that's behavior science. If you don't have that built into your mental well-being processes, they are going to be ineffective. It's just as simple as that. Okay. Just to give you an idea of the effectiveness, we have an 8-week program on our app, on our Mental Health Solution Awakened Mind, which is a self-led process over 8 weeks. And we had the University of Singapore research it, and they discovered that their emotional exhaustion, which is what most of you are suffering, by the way. So when you see the chat function, I really appreciate those of you sharing. You're actually struggling with what we call emotional exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion feels like a death by 1,000 cuts. It's like this pervasive sense of exhaustion. You wake up, maybe you've had a good sleep, but your eyes are still scratchy. There's this feeling of like, I just can't get myself motivated. That's emotional exhaustion. And what we found over 8 weeks, that people's emotional exhaustion reduced by up to 58% in a simple self-led process that follows simple information, clear ability, giving them clear instructions, simple things to do. There's a group process over time. So we know it works from an independent research. Interestingly enough, work engagement increased 37% as well. Now, just think about that for a moment, especially in terms of the comments. We're looking for changes externally. What we provided was a skill set helping people internally. Emotional exhaustion reduced dramatically without an expert needing to be there with them. And workplace engagement increases. It just highlights how significant the internal challenge is. And what I haven't said yet on this webinar is that we've also done surveys to ask people, were you ever educated on how to manage your own mind and how to manage your own emotional world at school, at university, at PhD? And when we actually ask people that live, we get 100% people saying no. We did a big survey on LinkedIn. We had 50,000 views on the survey. 90% of people said, no, I've never been taught these skills. So is it any wonder that we are always looking externally, and we're also looking for an event because we're not internally educated? And that's another thing that needs to happen, internal education. The second thing I wanted to talk about is that resources are often misguided. All right, it's not only about horizontal development. Now, this is a quite complex subject to introduce you to, but relatively simple once you get it. So in the world of adult development, which is the latest and greatest part of probably leadership as well as mental health, it's the idea of helping people grow. It's become divided where you can divide development into 2 boxes, horizontal development and vertical development. And the easiest way to explain this and its relevance to mental well-being is a real story. So we had a client who was diagnosed with, on a 360 assessment, that they were not following through on their promises and commitments, and therefore they were losing trust. If you looked at their lives were hectic, lots of overwork, overwhelm, a lot of the things that you've highlighted in the chat function, a lot of overwhelm, this amazing level of overwhelm, exhaustion, and sort of trying to be everyone to everything with all the demands. There was another OD consultant, more like a process design OD consultant working in this that I knew. And he said to me, this person needs time management skills. It's very evident that they are mismanaging their time. Now, that's a classic horizontal development solution. So we look at the person's life, we see mismanaging of time, and then we go, solution must be managing of time. It's kind of like, it's nice and simple, it needs, it fits, and it assumes that the problem is a skills gap. It doesn't assume that the problem is an emotional mismanagement or a lack of self-awareness or a lack of inner growth. It just assumes the person's got all of that and they just need the skills. Of course, the time management course failed. And then we were asked to help that person. And what we became interested in, we put them through one of our programs. We helped them develop an understanding of what they are doing on a daily basis that's resulting in the mismanagement. And they discovered that the key thing they were doing is overcommitting. So if you take the example that some of you have given, that you're feeling overwhelmed, there's a good chance that you might be overcommitting from a place of obligation and duty. She very quickly discovered that when she's overcommitting, the reason she's overcommitting is because she really, really needs people to like her and approve of her. In other words, she has some degree of self-worth issues, which most of us have. But that behavior of overcommitting, when people asked her to do things and she said, yes, yes, and then they went, great, thanks, was a kind of like dopamine hit of approval. Oh, got the approval. But it resulted in a mess in her life. Vertical development is helping her begin to look inwards. It's like not adding more plants to the garden. It's like weeding the garden is probably a better way of thinking of vertical growth. So in her case, she had to learn to see the pattern of overcommitting. She began to understand that it was out of integrity. She was actually out of the very values, out of whack with the values that she helped. She valued integrity, but when she's saying yes, it feels like integrity, but it's more like an addiction speaking. It's just like the wanting to approve. And if she stopped with a bit of like self-management skills, self-awareness, she began to realize, I'm overcommitting, and in this moment, I'm out of integrity because there's no ways I'm going to be able to follow that up. And then she became really good at being apologetic and sweet, so she could kind of get away, but her life was a mess, and she was struggling with her mental well-being. But as soon as we got to the self-awareness development, right, the vertical development, things dramatically changed for her. Her life started getting boundaries in it. She started having clearer boundaries at home, clearer boundaries at work. She was able to disappoint people. So that internal awareness growth, the awareness of her behavior patterns, the ability to interrupt those behavior patterns, resulted in one simple behavior change: saying no. That's motivation. My life's a mess. I've been given bad feedback. That's the motivation. Ability on the behavior side, one simple practice: say no more often. Be clear, check in when people ask you to do things, say no. And then this ability to manage the inevitable pain of not getting the approval, that's all vertical development, not horizontal, not adding skills, allowed her to start cleaning up and becoming more and more well. Now, it's different for each person. These skill sets, this is one story illustrating it. But unless you've got the ability to see inside, know the patterns, know which of your behavior patterns help you and which don't, you basically are going to keep wishing the external world will change, or you're going to keep trying to add more skills. While it's like you're painting the Titanic. Nothing's really changing. You're just putting prettier paint in it, but it's still sinking. And that's one of the biggest challenges we have, because you see the irony is that if you're not helping people with the skills of looking inwards and managing themselves more often, you'll just keep throwing resources at them of more and more and more, hoping that it will change. And that's why we see so many organizations with mental well-being strategies that look good on paper, but actually are really ineffective. And vertical development explains that, exactly why they're ineffective. And it kind of morphs into our third point I wanted to touch on today, that all mental well-being is underpinned by self-regulation. And then the question we've always had is, can you do that at low cost and scale? Because it's quite a deep subject, self-regulation. Now, if we take the example I've just mentioned, her ability to say no, to have the insight that, oh, I'm overcommitting. That's an insight that comes from vertical development and self-awareness. To know the behaviors, to know the alternative way is excellent. But if she can't regulate, in other words, interrupt the behavior real time and make real time different choices, nothing changes. And if nothing changes, mental well-being does not change. And tragically, this is really poorly taught, as I mentioned earlier. And it's the key ingredient for all mental well-being efforts, and again, for all growth efforts. So we've got this question we ask our clients over and over again. And the question is this: so if I ask you to be self-aware right now, what would you do? And I recall, some of you may know this, but I'm not going to mention names, but I recall asking an extremely senior leader, global executive, this question about 3 or 4 years ago. I asked him, so do you regard yourself as self-aware? And he said, yeah, I've done a lot of self-awareness work. I said, okay. And then I asked him this question: so if I ask you to be self-aware right now, what would you do? And to his credit, he was honest. He stopped completely cold, and he said, I don't know, I have no idea. Ask you for feedback, which is not the right answer. And he was stunned that he thought he was self-aware, but he had no idea how to practice and cultivate self-awareness as a real skill. And the consequences of that are quite dramatic, because without this skill, how do you know when you're thinking and acting in ways that erode your well-being? So you have no ability to actually look at your own behavior honestly or objectively. You're lost in the patterns of your behavior with no idea, no sense of regulation, no sense of observation, no sense of objective evaluation. You're just doing what you're doing. And unfortunately, that we now know from acceptance commitment therapy, which is kind of the gold standard of anxiety and depression therapy training for helping people with anxiety and depression, is that without this ability to regulate, mindfulness practice to regulate and to see, we invariably get caught in what's called fast brain or fast pathway patterns of behavior that give us instant gratification, but actually erode our well-being long-term. And an easy example would be, you've had a rough day. Some of you have given some beautiful examples on the chat function. You've had a rough day, you come home and that glass of wine or 2 or 3 becomes very appealing because you just want to numb the overwhelm away. And you have the glass of wine and it feels great, but you're not monitoring carefully enough the overall impact on that. It feels good now, but are you aware of what it does to your sleep? Are you aware of what it does to your mood? Are you aware of what it does to your relationships? Are you aware of it over time? Without that objective awareness, we keep getting caught in immediate gratification that feels good at the time, but erodes our well-being. And if you don't know and have any ability to regulate or know it in the moment, you're going to keep going with old habits. And also without the skill, how do you consciously and deliberately cultivate behaviors that support your and others' well-being? As I said, you're going to get caught in what is a strong word, addiction, but it's how we are. We get caught in these immediate gratification behaviors. So classically, you could ask someone, could you meditate 10 minutes a day? And most people would say, 10 minutes a day, I don't have time for that. But if you looked at their phone and the amount of time they spend on social media, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours a day on meaningless social media, and that person can still be convinced that they don't have time to meditate for 10 minutes a day. That is because of a complete lack of objective self-awareness. It's like we are blind to our own lives. And if we don't have that skill, we simply can't. It doesn't matter what skills we get taught, what mental well-being strategies we get, we are not really going to be able to do much about it. And what's really interesting is I gave the example of leadership, right? So this particular leader, I said, who didn't know the self-awareness skills, he, after practicing the self-awareness skills that we gave him, interestingly enough, he said, he made this really insightful observation, and he was generous enough to be interviewed in a new book I'm writing. And he said, I didn't realize that I always prided myself on not being driven by my emotions when I was making decisions. Since I've practiced self-awareness, I've discovered that 90% of my decisions are based on emotions that I was blind to. And he gave a really easy example. He said, one of my worst habits as a leader is that I don't confront people. I don't give people enough accountability and clarity. I had very sophisticated ways of justifying that in my mind. But now that I've got the self-awareness and I'm more honest with myself, I now see that I'm confronted emotionally by those conversations. So my emotional fragility has resulted in me avoiding those conversations, which has resulted in, ironically, more anxiety in my system because I'm not in integrity. And then I keep covering it up with rationalization. So there's this whole kind of mess going on that I've been unaware of. And now I've got the awareness, I can make much healthier choices. And then his question to us at the time was, which prompted the development of all of our digital solutions, was, but how can you train that to thousands of people at scale? Is that even possible? And we know it is possible. And interestingly enough, from our own digital 8-week program, which is not even led by us, it's self-led. Interestingly enough, we didn't give any leadership techniques in this program. We just gave self-awareness practices. Interesting enough, is on top of the 58% reduction in emotional exhaustion, the people who ran these programs, and this would be a perfect thing for you, of course. It's like, how do I create a process that we can grow together and learn together and become well together? The leader themselves had 25% improvement in perceived effectiveness as a leader. Remember, all they were practicing was self-awareness skills together with the group. So coming towards, how are we doing on time? We're nice and early on time. We may have some time for a few questions in the chat function. Julian, are there any, before I get to this, maybe I can just pause there. Are there any questions you've picked up that might be worthy of me chatting to? Julian?
There are no specific questions for now. All good.
Okay, great. So if anything comes to mind, please pop them in the chat function. Julian will keep monitoring it. So when we look at where to from here, so I'll just recap, right? We've talked about 3 key things. We've talked about that if you've got a mental well-being strategy that's event-based or gift-based, like a lot of clients that we've spoken to have given gift packages or care packages to their employees, which, to be fair, are great. I don't think in any way, shape or form, they're a bad thing. They're lovely. They show care, they show, connection, they show some thoughtfulness. But what they don't do is they don't develop any skills, they don't develop any behavior change over time, and they don't really fix anything fundamental. They're a nice that doesn't really make any fundamental difference. So you could argue that they're a misspending, a poor spending of precious resources. So we know that an event doesn't change anything. It's a process over time. I also know personally, I've had the privilege and curse, if you will, of doing long, really serious meditation retreats, 10, 20 days where you're meditating 12 hours a day. Those are great as an event, but also, interestingly enough, even those, if you don't sustain practice in your life, the effect drops off really quickly. So that's point number 1, we need to create an environment, a process for sustained practice of healthy habits together. That's point 1. Point 2 is that we need to help people with vertical development, which is really all about self-understanding, self-knowing, and self-awareness. The latest out of Robert Keegan will tell us that vast majority of the population have very, very low self-awareness, and they are mostly, their sense of self-worth and value and meaning comes all from the external. It comes outside of themselves. So if I belong to the group, then I feel good. If I've got status in the group, then I feel good. If I'm financially safe, then I feel good. If it's stable, if the world is stable around me, I feel good. But ironically, all of those things are beyond our control. And as long as our sense of meaning and worth is very dependent on the external world, we will be in perpetual anxiety. It's no wonder we're increasing more and more anxiety and depression in our culture, because we've got more and more external pressures with less and less internal resource, and more addiction to screen time, et cetera, with less and less meaningful connection in our lives. And it's a cocktail for basically a mess. So second thing is, we need to help people self-understand versus just throwing more resources at them. Third point, the primary means to self-understanding is firstly the awareness to look at the technique and process to look internally. And then the second, the ability to manage ourselves in real time, and primarily to interrupt old habits that we've now become aware of that don't serve us or others, and then to choose healthier habits. How do we choose those healthier habits? We choose healthy habits based on our deepest values. And we actually have an interesting program, which is based on the gold standard of well-being, that covers in detail, how do you begin to orient about what's healthy and not healthy? How do you begin to see more accurately what are the behaviors you're doing that are actually, they feel good, but actually they're eroding our well-being? And then if you can do that in a group together, so even if you have one person you're doing this with, you can get exponential results. We know from LinkedIn research that if you do things together with people, it creates mutual accountability, but it also creates, it's 30 people who do things in groups are 30 times more engaged, as the research tells us, and when they do things individually. So those are the 3 key points I've covered. Can't see the next points here. So I'm just covering the 3 points I've already made in the webinar. So someone just asked me about the 3 points, and I'll just go back. I'll just show you quickly, and then I'll go back to the last point here. It was here. There, those are the 3 points. It's a process, not an event. And within that process and event, it's about simple behavior change supported over time with a degree of self-regulation and insight. When you don't understand that, you end up giving people, you clutter up the resources and give people more and more and more, but it doesn't actually address, doesn't help them deal with the internal 90%. And then all mental well-being is underpinned by this ability to self-regulate. Those are the points we've covered. And as we come towards a close, we're off nice and early, despite all my, we're nearly towards the end already, which I'm sure everybody would be grateful for if you've got lots to do in your day. So lastly, I'm just getting back to my slide here. Lastly, so what's the next steps for you? Now, again, you may have dialed into this webinar as an individual who's interested in, helping themselves. And for those of you of individuals, we would strongly recommend to download it. You can download our app and you can do a trial and start off with the mental well-being or the mindfulness essentials. You can do something right now for yourself. But for those of you who are in an OD HR role, it's a bit more of a complex question. And so what you want to do is you want to be able to assess where's your current mental well-being strategy, in at least in the minimum, in terms of a behavior science model. So how are you establishing motivation? If we go back to the FOG model we introduced earlier. Now, obviously, if you're still in this webinar, you are personally motivated. You must be motivated if you're still here now to help yourself and help others. But how do you help others be motivated? The second thing you need is the ability. And again, interestingly enough, in this space, ability equals simplicity. So how do you declutter all of your things you're doing and make it simple enough for people to understand and to actually succeed at a practice? And then lastly, how are you going to build prompts or shared experiences that create accountability and support and prompts over time in your strategy? If that's on your mind and you're in that space, then that's a lot more of a complex question. And for that, you're going to need to almost certainly speak to my colleague, Julian. And Julian and I have been obsessed with this question for the last 3 years. And as part of this webinar, we're offering a strategy session, and we're very clear about this. This is a strategy session with Julian on how to begin to understand, if you don't have a strategy, how to even think about formulating a mental well-being strategy. But if you do have a strategy and you've got lots of resources, how do you make sense of those resources and put them in an order that actually match basic behavior science and will make a meaningful difference? And so in that strategy review with Julian, our strategy consultant, will help you review your strategies. Now, this is really important to say. It's nothing to do with buying any of our products. Yes, we've got some really great products that match that science, but this is about helping you. So even if it's just a consultation where you just need someone to help you think through your strategy properly, and in the end you use someone else or you don't use internal resources, that's great, no problem. As long as you're helping people well, we're happy. Second part is, we'll also be able to share Julian will be able to share some insider insights from our clients. We're fortunate that we deal with a lot of clients around the world in this area, and we've seen what's working, we've seen what's working, and we can share and compare with you. And lastly, you may have some questions on vertical development. Vertical development is at one level extremely simple to practice and develop, and at another level, because it's new to so many people, it can be a bit perplexing and confusing, and particularly if it starts challenging some of your existing paradigms around throwing more horizontal development. And Julian can really help you with that too. So if you're interested in a chat around that with Julian, please scan the code there, and that'll give you a booking form. And again, you can chat with Julian about that. So, and Julian's popped a link in the strategy set in the chat function. So Julian, as I wrap up here, I'd like to just see, are there any last questions? I've got 5 minutes at least. I can answer a couple of questions. Just simple questions. I'm just reading. So Maya, you've asked the question, what resources would you suggest to help individuals look internally and raise self-awareness? There's many books you can read, but we've spent, to not sound disingenuous, we've spent millions of dollars and many, 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 many years on this subject. And we designed the programs on our app very specifically for that exact thing. Again, you can go download Awakened Mind off the App Store or the Google Play Store for free, and you can get straight into the training. We've very carefully made it simple and time effective. You can begin that journey of training of the mind. How do you get teenagers to understand long-term well-being over short-term gratification, Helen? The most important thing you can do on that is be a good role model. So I've been fortunate enough to have 4 kids and older kids and younger kids, and I found it's my role modeling has been easily the most important. So if you want to be a great parent, be a self-aware parent, and be a parent who regulates themselves, and be a parent who's connected with children. There's nothing more inspiring than a leader or a parent who you feel trust with and connected, but they're also a role model for it. It may not be in the short term, it might not seem as effective, but I've had the privilege of teenagers to now in their 20s, and it's amazing to watch how those lessons have landed in them. And they, my son, my eldest son just started a postgraduate at Oxford University in the UK the last 3 weeks, and I had no idea, but he just casually announced to me a couple of days ago that he's meditating half an hour every day, and it's absolutely critical to him. And I never ever pushed that at all. I just practiced myself, and something has landed in him through example. So I would always say, don't try and change other people. Try and be the role model yourself, and then trust the process over time and stay connected with people. That's really, really important. Motivation techniques for casual staff for the job is only a source of money, not a passion or career path. Again, Jeremy, I just go back to the same thing again, is that you want to be a good role model. So it's almost like when we've seen people come into workplaces, even if they're casual, there's something in the air. What's different about this place? And it's that creates the motivation. It's not, people are not stupid. Unfortunately, you can't throw techniques. In fact, our research shows that if you give people, if you want to be a values-based organization and you're going to live the values, great. But if you're going to be published values and then not live, which tragically is most organizations, you're better off never having published values in the first place, because people are smart nowadays. They can see through things really quickly. So we would warn you against any kind of tips or tricks. We would say, and it sounds cheeky, and my apologies, it would be easier if I was talking to you person to person, but externalizing tips and tricks onto people to change them is not the right start. Well, we keep saying this to our clients. It's like the leaders who often ask us, how do I change my culture? And our response is, you change you first. How are you going with role modeling the values of your organization? When people look up, what do they see? Are they inspired or not? And of course, that's the harder of the two questions to answer, way harder than how do I fix other people? And it's, to be fair, again, we don't have the training to do that. So again, it's why we are so passionate about providing that training. It's like a gap in our education. How do I begin to role model openness, growth mindset, values more effectively, so that when casual people come into the organization and they work with us, it feels different and it feels more inspiring, and they feel happier or mentally healthier when they're working with us? That's the right start point. We always say that's the clients, that's the right start point. Yes, there should not be a disconnect between those two. Okay, great. Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate it. Yeah. Okay, so I think Julian, are there any more questions you've seen that are useful for me to answer? Otherwise, I think we can close the webinar. And again, if you want to, examine your own strategy in more detail, Julian's an expert on that. He's actually a lot more expert than I am, because he's dealing with a lot more clients than I am. I'm buried in the content creation and content development. Julian's buried in the strategy and helping clients understand their strategy with our content often included, but even without our content. I would strongly encourage you to have a chat with Julian. It's no fee. Julian saying thank you, everyone.
There is just a question that I'm sharing with you. Is in Italy, so all of this talk about self-awareness and vertical development, is in Italy like asking an employee to go to the gym and get stronger, rather than helping to modify the environment, give them support, and or reduce their load?
Okay, that's a great question, and I completely agree. But the question is, what's the environment? And the workload side of it is a controversial subject that I'm not really wanting to wade in. The truth of the matter is, if you don't have enough resources and workload is too much, you're fundamentally ignoring people. You're choosing, the leaders in that organization are choosing to deliberately ignore that, which is a lack of self-awareness, ironically. Most of the environment, though, we've discovered, it's in the behavior of the senior leaders. Like, you know, if the behavior of the senior leaders is not great, it doesn't matter how many ping pong tables and workload you do or don't give, the environment's still going to be toxic. So the primary, I'm not ignoring workload, and there's no webinar. Nobody can give you a webinar on how to fix the workload in your organization, because that's decided fundamentally by the leaders of the organization. Often the leaders play victim. It's like, oh, it's not us, it's the market. Actually, it is you, but we don't want to own that because there's guilt and mismanagement. And that leads back down to, again, a lack of self-awareness and a lack of honesty with ourselves and a lack of regulation. If you have that in senior leaders, then it does affect the environment. We're still saying, though, it doesn't matter how good that environment is. If people don't know how to manage themselves within that environment, they're going to mismanage themselves. So you've got this, like, I'm not ignoring at all the externalized part of it, but to use your analogy, it's like telling people to go to the gym while you overeating and abusing and giving people junk food all day and then telling them to go to the gym is a little bit nonsensical. At the very minimum, those people come into the organization. They need to see people who are role modeling fitness, if you will, and healthy behavior, and feel inspired by it to be able to do it themselves. You're still telling them to do it, but if they don't look up, now that's the cultural challenge I'm talking about. It's still possible to help people get to the gym, even if the role modeling is bad, but that requires additional support. And again, you're going to struggle with this in an organizational context, because no matter what comes out of leaders' mouths, if they're not role modeling it, it's always met with cynicism. And then any strategy you have that is around behavior or behavior change is going to fail. And then the leaders are going to get perplexed, because they're going to, why is this fail? It shouldn't. Everything looks right on paper, because the last place they will typically look is themselves. And again, it's not their fault. It's because they typically are just not trained. They don't know how to. So because they don't know how to, it's all externalized. So our emphasis is on the internal, not because the external is not important, but because the external is what we always obsess with, to the complete ignoring of the internal. And you can't really succeed one without the other. And the internal, particularly the internal values work, which is one of our programs heavily emphasizes on, tends to clean things up. If I have genuine care of my people as one of my values, why would I overload them and demand more and more and more and more? It doesn't make sense. It's incongruent, and I would feel that in my system if I'm doing that. Okay. All right. So I think that's a good time to close. Again, if you've got any additional questions, please scan the code, take it up with Julian. And if the questions get especially difficult, we might jump on a joint call with me, you, and Julian. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you dialing in and listening. Wishing you, especially those of you in earlier time zones, a wonderful rest of your day. And again, if you're an individual, you're welcome to go into the App Store right now and download Awaken Mind and check out the first module. Just get going into the first module training. It's there for you. The techniques of the how we haven't covered. We're trying to cover the context and the importance of other fundamentals in this webinar, but the how you can go and get. We've done that for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.